Hey guys, so welcome to your next video and the very last section of the entire year of biology. So I know that's pretty exciting because we are starting to wrap up the entire year. So a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in this next section and in this next chapter are all things we've kind of already discussed before. We've talked about them on a more broad scale, so we're going to bring it down, look at more specific scenarios, and understand how relationships between organisms is really important, not just for humans, but just in general for our entire earth and the recycling of matter and everything else like that. We are going to focus on the biotic portion of an ecosystem. So if you remember from a long time ago, we talked about abiotic versus biotic. So more like the living organisms versus non-living things, I guess, if you will, where they're not really organisms if they're not living. But anyway, so we're going to break this down and we're going to look at how an ecosystem is affected by the different organisms that live in those areas. And there are general relationships that follow in all types of biomes. So remember, like a biome is like a home, and it holds all of these types of species or these communities. And then the communities can be broken down into populations, which is one type of organism or species. And we'll get into all of those breakdowns here in a little bit. And I will be talking about all of that background in, when we take notes on these. So make sure that you leave room at the beginning of this slide because I didn't include, I didn't want to start with the introduction into ecology because we've already done that. And I feel like you guys have done that for like years and years and years. You've talked about food chains. You talked about all that stuff. So I'm just going to remind you about it, and then we're going to start talking about community interactions. So how these different species in a community work together to really keep things in balance. After this video, you should be able to define community as the term is used in ecology, describe predation and its effects on population size and evolution, explain why interspecific competition leads to extinction or greater specialization, compare and contrast mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism, and finally outline primary and secondary succession and define climax community. So that's quite a bit. There's only 4 slides in this, so you can expect that I'll be talking a lot. You should probably be listening, and you should expect that we'll have a lot of notes on this. All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about what is a community. So a community is the biotic part of an ecosystem. So all things that consist of a living organisms, everything that's living is a part of a community. And this consists of all populations of all the species in the same area. Okay, so we're not just talking about one specific type of species. We are talking about all species and those interactions they have with one another. Species interactions and communities are important factors in natural selection. So if you don't know what natural selection is, we are going to write it down in class. But natural selection is the idea that favored traits or the strong will survive. So traits that will help lead to a population to success is natural selection. So they are selected to live in that specific type of environment. Like I said, communities help shape the natural selections. They help shape evolution of an interacting species. There are 3 major types of community interactions. So the interactions are, like I said, the biggest component when it comes to communities. So predation, competition, and symbiosis are the 3 types of interactions we're going to talk about. And you've heard of all these. You've probably watched like Natural Geographic documentaries on these types of interactions. So they're really fun to watch, and some of them not so much. But all of these types of interactions are what make a community successful. The first one I want to talk about is predation. And predation is a relationship in which members of one species, generally the predator, consume members of another species, also known as the prey. So the greatest example, a lioness and zebra. These are classic examples of predator and prey. They obviously go hunt, they spot what they want, and then they kill the zebra, their prey. Now, believe it or not, just because I talked about a lion and a zebra, and in this case, the zebra happened to be the prey, in some other cases, the zebra could be the predator. So you think, okay, well, what is the zebra predating or whatever? Grasses, right? Grass is living. It's a living organism, and if the zebra goes and eats it, it's the prey. So it consumes prey species. In this case, it is grass. However, unlike the lion, the zebra does not kill its prey. So predator-prey relationships such as these account for the most types of energy transfer in food chains and food webs. So we've talked about that. A long time ago, we talked about secondary, tertiary, and so on and so forth. When you directly get your source of energy from a plant, you're going to get the most energy that comes from the sun, and then you go on to your secondary consumers, and your secondary consumers get 10% less than the initial primary consumer. And so that transfer of energy goes down. So that's why organisms that prey on nothing but meat need to eat a little more, because they are not getting as much energy from their source. Yes, they're getting a lot, but they're not getting as much as you would when you're eating that much grass. Another great thing about the predator-prey relationship is the fact that it helps keep populations in balance. And this is not just of one species, it's of both species. So as long as the predator can get its prey, the populations of both will generally stay a good balance that doesn't take away the important factors of an ecosystem. So let's say that the number of prey really increases. That means that there will be more food for a predator, which is great. But after so much time, the predator population starts to increase. So that means that there's more competition for food. Then that's that nice check and balance where the prey population goes down, predator population goes down. Prey population increases, predator population increases, but there's that constant check and balance. If prey did not have a predator, they would go unbalanced, and then you'd have a crazy amount of prey just walking around, really not doing much for the ecosystem. So I know you think it's sad when a zebra gets tackled and mauled, but it's actually really quite essential for an ecosystem and for a population. And so the next thing I'm going to talk about when I talk about predators is what's known as a keystone species. And a keystone species is one that plays an especially important role in its community. Major changes in the numbers of a keystone species affect the population of many species in the community. So what I'm saying, and I've already kind of described this, what I'm saying is if I were to take a predator out of an ecosystem, that leaves the opportunity for prey to go unchecked and will continue to grow and grow and grow. And that could essentially kill the entire ecosystem of one community. So it's really important that all species have some sort of check and balance. The next relationship I want to talk about is competition. And you probably already know what this means, but it's where more than one organism are fighting for the same resources. So the resources might be food, water, or even just space to live in. So there are two different types of competition. One's known as intra-specific competition, and this occurs between members of the same species. So for example, male birds, if they want to compete for mates in the same area, they really need to make sure that they stand out in comparison to others so that they can ensure that they pass on their seed. Oh my God, that sounds gross. But yeah, they want to pass on their genetics and they want to be successful. So they need to make sure that they really stand out. The next type is interspecific competition, and this occurs between members of different species. And so, like I said, we've already talked about predators, but predators of different species might compete for the same type of prey. So we have hyenas and we have lions, and they may be competing for the same zebra. And that poor zebra is going to have to run a lot. But that's okay because they probably have evolved to run fast enough to get away, so they're not always dying. And the last type of relationship I want to talk about is symbiotic relationships. So symbiosis is a close relationship between two species in which one at least benefits the other, maybe not so. So for the other species, the relationship may be positive, negative, or neutral. Three basic types of symbiosis are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So some of those may not be the greatest. And I'll give you details on all three of those in class because I realize that this slide, I've been on it for quite a long time and I want to kind of get moving. But again, remember those are mutualism, commensalism, parasitism. In this slide, I would leave room in between every single portion of this. So leave space in between the first part and predation. Leave a lot of space in between predation because I'm going to give you a graph that I want you to be able to interpret. Competition, leave some space, and symbiosis, leave quite a bit of space because we're going to talk about those three things and give you those definitions and examples. Last thing I want to talk about is ecological succession. So what does it mean to be successful as an ecosystem? So the big thing you need to know is that ecosystems or communities, I'm sorry, I keep saying ecosystems, but communities are not just stagnant. The community that we know now is not the community that was here 1,000 years ago or even 100 years ago. They're constantly changing with the change in and prey and predator and soil and human interaction. All of these things help shape and change communities. So the numbers and types of species that live in them generally change through time. This is called ecological succession. So there are different ways to distinguish between succession. There's primary and there's secondary. Primary succession occurs in an area that has never been colonized. So basically an area that is like nothing but rocks. And this type of environment may come from like lava, glaciers, landslides, things like that. There's not really an established soil. There's not really anything there. You would think nothing grows there. That is primary succession. So the first species that would go in there to try and disturb this area or call this area home is what's known as a pioneer species. And they change the environment and pave the way for other species to come through. Pioneer species are likely to include bacteria and lichen that live on bare rocks. From there, you have that growth or that change because as bacteria and as lichen continue to grow, they call for more species to come in. And as those more species come in, more and more will come because there's more of a food balance or more of an unchecked balance that really needs to get checked. So primary succession is really a great way to help establish a new community in a new area. Secondary, oh my gosh, you know what I didn't do? I'm talking and I didn't even move this slide. So everything that I just said actually goes with this slide. Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. But yeah, primary succession is when something is not colonized and it gets colonized by we're beginning with pioneer species, which are generally your bacteria and your lichen, and then it starts to progress from there. Secondary succession is when formerly inhabited areas that were once disturbed then get repopulated. So this occurs generally like when fires happen or floods or human actions such as farming. These types of things can cause secondary succession to happen. So this type of succession is faster because the soil is already in place. In this case, the pioneer species are plants such as grasses, trees, fireweed, things like that. Organic matter from the pioneer species improves the soil, and this allows the plant life to flourish. From there, things just really progress on. So secondary succession does happen faster. There's a great example of secondary succession. If you go out of Lakeview towards Sac, I don't know directions and you know that, but if you go towards Sac, I want to say that's like north. That's definitely wrong, I think. It doesn't matter. Either way, when you're going towards like under the viaduct and all that stuff, there's like a spot of DNR land that has been specifically put off, and you'll see that it's like it's a wetland and it has like a lot of like what looks like weeds and areas like that. That's a great example of secondary succession, where the natural habitat of a community has been established and is preserved, and that's really what it's supposed to look like. Now, I'm not saying that we're not supposed to farm or anything, so don't take that way, but I'm just saying that secondary succession is very successful. It does happen. We just have to allow it to happen. The last part I do want you to write down, but I'm not going to talk about it now. It's known as climax communities. So write that term down after secondary succession, and we will talk about it in much more detail later, I guess not later, but when we take the notes. But that's pretty much it for this video. I know this was pretty quick and there was a lot of information. If you have any questions, please make sure to write it down. Ask me on Edpuzzle or ask me in class. Do what you got to do. I will talk to you later.